We mentioned it's a tough music day for Scott. We're committed to play the Magic Victory song, and when it happens on a Tuesday, it's tough for Scott because it's a double shot Tuesday, but he's really excited because today's May 4th, so for him and all the Star Wars fans, it's Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you. Plus, he's going to ride the new roller coaster at Universal today.
Yep.
Theme today is space-themed music, songs that have space or the artists, and here we go with a little Peter Schilling and Major Tom.
Yes.
50857, the Academy of Sports and Outdoors text line. So the draft is done, and after we did mock drafts, then we do draft grades, and then we try to figure out who's right, and then we go watch the players play. Our next guest does a deep dive in studying the analytics of all this stuff. Benjamin Robinson, the creator of Grinding the Mocks. You can find his work at Football Outsiders and elsewhere, and he's done some really good stuff, and he's kind of joined us as we still do a little post-draft stuff. Benjamin, welcome. Good morning. How are you?
Doing well. Just finally rested after the draft, so feeling good.
Okay, so a little bit of a background. You wrote a piece last year doing a deep dive when it comes to taking a look at people that give draft grades and if there's some trends that stand out in there. Can you share a little bit about that, and then we'll dive into what you included last year and then even looking at this year?
Sure. So, the first thing about the draft is that, there's a lot of randomness associated with it. And so, it kind of came into this process thinking of, how do we think about, after the draft, once we know where players land, thinking about, how we get an early sense of the kind of temperature in the room when it comes to, how are these players going to perform. And so draft grades was a kind of idea where my editor, Aaron Schatz, who's the founder of Football Outsiders, said, hey, let's look into this and see if there's any predictive power that we can learn right after the draft when we know where players have gone around how their draft classes will do. And the first thing that I noticed when I looked at the information that I collected, going all the way back to 2012 up to 2017, so that we have at least 3 years of production to look at, was that you remember the old bell curve in school where the average grade is a C? Well, draft grades are graded on a curve pretty well. The average draft grade put out by, well, not really the average, but the kind of center of the distribution is a B, BB plus. So not only are draft graders really nice, which I think can be explained kind of by human psychology, when we look at kind of the slope of the curve, when we want to look at production versus this draft grade, if the draft grades were good at predicting production, we would expect the kind of curve to be sloping upwards. So as draft grades increased, production would go up. Instead, it's completely flat. So that means that on both sides of the curve, grades are good at predicting and bad at the same time. So there's basically, they cancel each other out. So draft grades have no predictive power really at all for predicting how teams will do in terms of their draft class performance.
All right, two quick things. Yes, the bell curve got me a C in Dave Denslow's economics class at Florida despite a 48% score. So, yes. But let me follow up. Our draft grades, do they often tend to be positive, meaning, well, we don't want to really rip these teams, so instead of the C or C minus, as you said, the B, so it seems as if our experts are perhaps too positive?
I think there's a reason for this, and I think it comes from human psychology. So there's this concept called, risk aversion or loss aversion. So no one wants to be that draft analyst who gave a draft class a really bad grade, and then you come back 10 years later and they're just getting ripped all over the internet. So, for example, the awesome Seahawks draft class that netted, Russell Wilson and Bobby Wagner, all those guys that powered the Seahawks to Super Bowls, that draft class got a really bad grade. And every time someone brings up, Mel Kiper's draft grades, they'll say, oh, he can't be trusted. He gave the Seahawks a D or something like that. So I think there's a sense of, hey, I can take the middle ground. No one remembers who gave a B to a really good class. So I think there's a sense of people want to cover their butt a little bit when it comes to that. So they give a, maybe not a bad grade, but a lukewarm grade so that if in case it turns out okay, then they're covered. They're good.
I like, how you wrote, and from a standpoint of charts, being drafted by good teams also matters, right?
Yeah, it does a little bit. So when I was kind of unsatisfied, really, with the result that the draft grades didn't matter. And so I kind of decided, well, that's helpful. And, maybe it's just the kind of world where we live in where, if you say that there's no relationship, people are like, oh, well, I'll move on. I kind of looked into it a little bit deeper and found out that, basically, which I think is kind of a little bit of a quirk of the production statistic that I used, that it did help to be drafted on good teams. So, I think that if you're drafted onto a team that does well, it usually means I think that they have either, better coaching or better front office or some sort of environment that puts you in a position to win. And so there was some signal there around, hey, what team did you end up with? And so maybe that's a little bit of a quirk of the statistic that I used, but I thought it was an interesting way. And there was some predictive power out of it where, we felt that if you included the draft grades, there was not a lot there, but if you added some other contextual factors, it helped. So good teams are good, I guess, that's not a huge, finding, but I thought it was something that added a little bit more color to the discussion than just the draft grades are poor in terms of how they're constructed, and there's no relationship at all. I felt like I could stop there, but I didn't want to sell the readers short.
Yeah. I'm sure the people that you work with and others and a few people that I've talked to that work at NFL teams, I always ask this question: how different are draft boards from one team to the next? And I always get probably the top 50 is not that big of a change, but you'd be shocked that somebody could have a player 61 on one board, another team can have at 170 or something like that. So, which leads to something else I know you looked at: expected draft position versus the actual draft slot. At a 21's draft, what do you see?
Yeah, so, I have this other project, Grinding the Mocks, where basically what I do is I, collect a big sampling of mock drafts and kind of try to model where the kind of core wisdom of the crowd sees players going. And so just purely from, hey, where we expected a player to go to where they were selected, a team like the Chicago Bears had a really strong draft in terms of that metric. People think that, they must have gotten a lot of value out of just drafting Justin Fields. It wasn't really even that. I had Justin Fields, around the 10th spot or so in my rankings, and he went 11th. So that's not a huge gain in terms of, draft capital over expected, which is what I call the metric. But, they had a lot of value throughout the draft when it comes to, Tevin Jenkins in the second round, who I thought was going to be a mid-round prospect. At the same time, they gave up a lot of, future assets to get those current assets. So that's not something that, those numbers that I published accounts for. But, the Bears gave up quite a bit of draft capital to get Justin Fields, and they also traded up to get Tevin Jenkins. So, and this is some of the danger when it comes to giving a GM who's potentially and a coach on the way out one more draft, because they can spend a lot of the potential future general manager and the future coach's draft capital. So I really liked the Bears draft. I also sneakily really loved, and this hasn't been the case in recent years, the Patriots draft. I thought they got a really good amount of value when it comes to Mac Jones, when it comes to Christian Barmore, the defensive tackle from Alabama, who I think some people had going, late mid-first round, ended up in the second, and then Ronnie Perkins from Oklahoma. So, in the past, I think it's kind of combined with the decline of the Patriots, where they really weren't drafting for value. This year, maybe they're riding the ship, and I like the Patriots going forward in terms of a team that'll improve relative to last year. The Patriots lost kind of more in the data when we call adjusted games lost, which is a great Football Outsider stat when it comes to players that they lost to injury and to COVID than any team in the NFL. So I think Patriots are a team, a positive regression team for next year, partially because of the return from last year and partially because of the draft this year, which I think will serve them well going forward.
In college football recruiting, I always chuckle when people are ranking classes before they played a game. I said, come back and show me those rankings in year 4 and 5. How many stayed? How many became starters? How many games and championships did they win? So I'll ask you, what's a fair time to evaluate a draft class? Is it fair to say don't do it in year 1, year 4, year 5? Does it matter? How many years before you can get a fair assessment as to what that class was?
I think for the most part, when we look at evaluating the draft, it's good to give 3 years at least. There's a lot of times where players may not see the field in year 1. There's depending on the situation they're coming into. Could be, injury related. It could be an adjustment to the NFL that needs to happen. So 3 years, I think, is fair. A lot of people after this season are already, on the, Justin Herbert, who was drafted by the Chargers clearing him and crowning him as the best quarterback. I think that's like declaring the winner of the Kentucky Derby at the quarter mile point or whatever. There's still a lot of race left to go. So I think we just need to be patient. And I know it's hard in the media world. We want to have content, information, and takes right now. But I think it's prudent to give teams 3 years is kind of the very earliest I would begin to assess a draft class, 4 or 5, when you're beginning to assess the top picks in terms of teams deciding to take up that 5th-year option for the first-round players. Those are the ones where you want to see what the second contract looks like for some of those guys before you decide really whether a draft class did well or not. And then also thinking about expectation. If you have a lot of draft capital and you don't get as much out of it as other teams that have less, then that's even more damning of your draft. So there's a long time. We need to wait. So right now, this summer, my plan is to do some analysis on the 2018 class, and even that might be considered a little bit early. But 3 years at least I think is a right way to go.
Broad question. Finally, I want to let you go. Are we better? And I say we because of people like you and the work at the places that you're at that now provide such advanced analytic stuff and whatever degree NFL teams are using. Are we better at evaluating the quarterback position? We make such a big deal, and rightfully so, about it. And now with the world of analytics such a part of football, are we better than we were 5 years ago and 3 years ago or 10 years ago in determining this player here is going to be successful? Or is it still somewhat of a crapshoot? Are we better at this?
I don't think we're better at it. That's my default, is to kind of be humble. So I think, for example, the people tend to kind of overweight what you see. And so, on both sides of the coin, in terms of people who look at the film and people who look at the data. People who look at the data say, I only see the production. And so a guy like, Trey Lance this year is really scary when it comes to data, when you use data to project quarterbacks, because he didn't play a lot. He played at a lower level of competition. And when he did play, he didn't throw the ball a lot. And you're going to ask him to do a lot of different stuff in the NFL. When you watch the traits, you see a lot of things too. So there's like a happy marriage between the two. I think that teams use a lot more data these days than they did in the past. But there's just such a lot of luck involved in terms of the situation they fall into. So to me, I'm just going to kind of be humble and say that we have a lot more information than we used to. Some of that information is better information. But I think that for the most part, we're not any better or worse than we were in the past in terms of quarterbacks. I think we are taking more swings at quarterbacks. I think there is a realization way more than before that, taking a chance on a quarterback is worth it, even if you might already have a quarterback. I think in the past, maybe teams are more willing to take swings at other chances. So I think hopefully more and more people realize how valuable the quarterback is. So I think there's more investment and more attention paid given the prominence of the position. But if I had to put my feet to the fire, I would say we're not better at projecting who's going to be the best quarterback 5 or 10 years ago than we were right now. But we are taking more swings at it. The more swings you have, the more likely you are to get hit. And so maybe that's what we're seeing now a little bit more than before.
I respect the answer. It's a good one. Benjamin Robinson is on Twitter at BenJ_Robinson. GrindingTheMocks.com. His work is also up at footballoutsiders.com.